Africa in world history. Long before Rome, continent's people were scientists, scholars, builders. August 1976, by John Henrik Clarke. The distinguished Afro-American poet Countee Cullen began his famous poem Heritage with the question, "What is Africa to me?" In order to understand Africa and its place in world history, we must extend the question by asking, what is Africa to the Africans and what is Africa to the world? There is a need to locate Africa and its people on the map of human geography. Our own great historian W.E.B. Du Bois tells us, always, Africa is giving me something new. On its black bosom arose one of the earliest, if not the earliest, of self-protecting civilizations and grew so mighty that it still furnishes superlatives to thinking and speaking men. Out of its darker and more remote forest fastnesses came, if we may credit many recent scientists, the first welding of iron, and we know that agriculture and trade flourished there when Europe was a wilderness. Dr. Du Bois tells us further that nearly every human empire that has arisen in the world, material and spiritual, has found some of its greatest crises on this continent of Africa. It was through Africa that Christianity became the religion of the world. In Africa, the last flood of Germanic invasions spent itself within hearing of the last gasp of Byzantium, and it was again through Africa that Islam came to play its great role of conqueror and civilizer. It is generally conceded in most scholarly circles that mankind originated in Africa. This makes the African man the father and the African woman the mother of mankind. This is where we began our assessment of the role of Africa and its people in world history. Early men in Africa became geniuses at surviving under harsh circumstances. Present-day archaeologists have dug up and preserved the evidence of their achievement. They made hooks to catch fish, spears to hunt with, stone knives to cut with, the bolo with which to catch birds and animals, the blowgun, the hammer, and the stone axe. In his pamphlet, The African Contribution, the writer John W. Weatherman gives us this additional evidence. Today's cannon, long-range missiles, ship propellers, automatic hammers, gas engines, and even meat cleavers and the upholstery tack hammers have the roots of their development in the early African use of power. Africans gave mankind the first machine. It was the fire stick. It is the making of tools that sets man apart from, and in a sense, above all living creatures. Africans started mankind along the tool-making path. Canoes made it possible for man to travel farther and farther away from his original home. They began to explore the many rivers in Africa, like the Nile, the Congo, and the Niger. It was in this way that the early peopling of Africa started and organized societies began. At some time years later, Africans driven by curiosity or some force of nature began to leave Africa in large numbers. They became the most widely dispersed of all people. Evidence of their presence at some time in history has been found in nearly every part of the world. Africa was already old when what we now call Europe was born. The Ghanaian historian Joseph B. Dankwa called attention to this fact in his introduction to the book United West Africa, or Africa, at the Bar of the Family of Nations by Ladipo Solanke, 1927, when he said, by the time Alexander the Great was sweeping the civilized world with conquest after conquest, from Chironia to Gaza, from Babylon to Kabul. By the time this first of the Aryan conquerors was learning the rudiments of war and government at the feet of philosophic Aristotle, and by the time Athens was laying down the foundations of modern European civilization, the earliest and greatest Ethiopian culture had already flourished and dominated the civilized world for over 4.5 centuries. Imperial Ethiopia had conquered Egypt and founded the 25th dynasty, and for a century and a half, the central seat of civilization in the known world was held by the ancestors of the modern Negro, maintaining and defending it against the Assyrian and Persian empires of the East. Thus, at the time when Ethiopia was leading the civilized world in culture and conquest, East was East, but West was as yet to be held. Rome was nowhere to be seen on the map, and 16 centuries were to pass before Charlemagne would rule in Europe and Egbert become first king of England. Even then, history was to drag on for another 700 weary years before Roman Catholic Europe could see fit to end the Great Schism, soon to be followed by the disturbing news of the discovery of America and by the fateful rebirth of the youngest of world civilizations. The French writer Count C.F. Volney, in his book Ruins of Empire, 1789, made a similar statement after observing the evidence of what was once a great Ethiopian empire. This was his observation: a people now forgotten discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men now rejected for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. The present search for the place of African people in world history and the Black Power revolution that produced the Black and Beautiful concept out of which the Black Studies Revolution emerged is part of a chain reaction to the absence of African people from the accepted commentaries on world history. This also means that we as an African people reject the rejection referred to in Count Volney's observations, and we are now demanding that other people acknowledge our contribution to world history and their indebtedness to us. It can be said with a strong degree of certainty that Africa has had 3 golden ages. The first 2 reached their climax and were in decline before Europe as a functioning entity in human society was born. Africa's first golden age began at the beginning with the birth of man and the development of organized societies. In his book, The Progress and Evolution of Man in Africa, Dr. L.S.B. Leakey states, in every country that one visits and where one is drawn into a conversation about Africa, the question is regularly asked by people who should know better: but what has Africa contributed to world progress? The critics of Africa forget that men of science today, with few exceptions, are satisfied that Africa was the birthplace of man himself, and that for many hundreds of centuries thereafter, Africa was in the forefront of all human progress. In the early development of man, the family was the most important unit in existence. Through the years, the importance of this unit has not changed. The first human societies were developed for reasons relating to the needs and survival of the family. The early African had to make implements with which to catch fish and animals for the family table. He searched for new ways of building shelter, gathering and raising food, and domesticating animals. Our use of fire today simply continues the process started by the early Africans, the control of fire. With the discovery of metals and how to use them, all Africa took a great leap forward. Man had learned how to take iron from the ground and turn it into spears and tools. Iron cultures spread rapidly across Africa, and there were very few parts of Africa that were not influenced by these Iron Age cultures. Iron cultures had their greatest development in the area of Africa that is now the Eastern Sudan, in the great city-state of Meroe. The use of fire accelerated every aspect of African development and introduced a new danger: the eventual use of iron weapons in warfare. The Nile River became a great cultural highway, bringing peoples and cultures out of inner Africa. These migrations by river led to the establishment of one of the greatest nations in world history, Egypt. In his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD, the Afro-American historian Chancellor Williams refers to Egypt as Ethiopia's oldest daughter and calls attention to evidence to prove the southern African origin of early Egyptian people and their civilization. Egypt first became an organized nation about 6000 BC. Medical interest centers upon a period in the Third Dynasty, 5345 to 6307 BC, when Egypt had an ambitious pharaoh named Zoser, and Zoser, in turn, had for his chief counselor and minister a brilliant commoner named Imhotep, whose name means he who cometh in peace. Imhotep constructed the famous step pyramid of Saqqara near Memphis. The building methods used in the construction of this pyramid revolutionized the architecture of the ancient world. Egypt gave the world some of the greatest personalities in the history of mankind. In this regard, Imhotep is singularly outstanding. In the ancient history of Egypt, no individual left a deeper impression than the commoner Imhotep. He was the world's first multi-genius. He was also the real father of medicine. In his book, Evolution of Modern Medicine, London 1921, page 10, Sir William Osler refers to Imhotep as the first figure of a physician to stand out clearly from the mists of antiquity. The period in Egyptian history from the Third Dynasty to the first invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos, or Shepherd Kings, in 1700 BC is, in my opinion, the apex of the First Golden Age. The Western Asian domination over Egypt lasted about 120 years and was ended by the rise of Egyptian nationalism during the 17th dynasty. During this period, the pharaohs, or kings, at Thebes consolidated their powers and began a united campaign to rid Lower Egypt of the Hyksos invaders. When the invaders from Western Asia were finally driven out by the pharaoh Ahmose I, the splendid 18th dynasty was established and Egypt's second golden age began. Egypt's golden age did not belong to Egypt alone, but included other nations in Africa, mainly Kush and Ethiopia, which at certain periods in history were one and the same. These nations farther to the south were the originators of the early culture of Egypt. Egypt at this juncture in history was no longer dependent on her cultural parents and was once more the most developed nation in the world. Again, rulers of monumental status were coming to power. Two of the best-known rulers of this period were Queen Hatshepsut and her brother Thutmose III. Great temples were built throughout the country, and the consequent employment of hundreds of artists and craftsmen prepared the way for the artistic glories which were still to come. During the reign of Thutmose III, the influence of Egypt was once more extended to Western Asia, now referred to as the Middle East. The age of grandeur continued. This age had a dramatic and lasting change in 1386 BC. Around that time, Queen T of Egypt gave birth to a boy who was first named Amenhotep after his father. Very little is known of his childhood, except that he was sickly from birth and developed an interest in art, poetry, and religion. His closest companion was said to be Nefertiti, his beautiful little cousin. Some archaeologists have referred to her as his sister. Akhenaton, often referred to as the heretic king, is one of history's most extraordinary monarchs. 1300 years before Christ, he preached and lived a gospel of love, brotherhood, and truth. He has been called the world's first idealist, the first temporal ruler ever to lead his people toward the worship of a single God. When Akhenaton came to the throne more than 3,000 years ago, Egypt dominated the world. Egypt's golden age gradually waned, and the pride and splendor that had marked the 18th and 19th dynasties gave way to internal strife and confusion. Wars of conquest and colonization had drained much of her military and economic strength. In the meantime, as the nations to the south grew more powerful, they became predatory toward Egypt, which had once been their master. The nation that is now called Ethiopia came back upon the center stage of history around 960 BC. It was then represented by a queen who in some books is referred to as Makeda and in others as Belkis. She is better known to the world as the Queen of Sheba. In his book, World's Great Men of Color, J.A. Rogers gives this description. Out of the midst of 3,000 years emerges this beautiful love story of a black queen who, attracted by the fame of a Judean monarch, made a long journey to see him. In Ethiopia, A Cultural History, Sylvia Pankhurst tells the story of this journey. The history of the Queen of the South, who undertook a long and arduous journey to Jerusalem in order to learn of the wisdom of King Solomon, is deeply cherished in Ethiopia as part of the national heritage, for she is claimed as an Ethiopian queen, Makeda, a woman of splendid beauty who introduced the religion and culture of Israel to her own land. By the 10th and 9th centuries BC, Egypt had been weakened by outside attacks and by bitter disputes between its priests and the royal families. This had allowed the Kushites to the south to gain a measure of independence. They now had the confidence to move northward and conquer their former masters. In spite of the war of conquest, these Kushite or Ethiopian kings brought Egypt her last age of grandeur and social reform. There is a need to make a serious study of this act of internal African colonization and what it achieved at the end of the Golden Age for the two great nations of Egypt and Kush. These Kushite kings restored the declining culture and economy of Egypt and took it to unprecedented heights of leadership in the way it cared for its people. Though a colony, Egypt was once more a world power. The Assyrian invasion of 671 BC drove the Kushite forces to the south and began the harshness and misrule that destroyed the grandeur that once was Egypt. Egypt continued to decline while a young nation on the other side of the Mediterranean, Greece, began to gather its power around 500 BC. In the year 332 BC, Alexander the Great, a student of Aristotle, invaded Egypt. This was the first purely European invasion of Africa. The aftermath of this invasion and the new European interest in dominating the trade of the Mediterranean world led to the Punic Wars and the invasion by the Romans. In Egypt, a strong and shrewd young girl tried to deal with the plight of her country under the threat of Roman domination. Her name was Cleopatra. In the 6th and 7th centuries AD, Roman rule began to lose its hold on North Africa and the Middle East. African genius for state building and for bringing new societies into being was reborn in the Western Sudan, inner West Africa, where the third and last African Golden Age began. The first of the great empires of the Western Sudan to become known to the outside world was Ghana. It began as a small settlement during the 2nd century of the Christian era. It would later develop into a state with a known history of more than 1,000 years. In Europe and in the Arab countries, Ghana was known as a country rich in gold. This was a natural attraction for the Arabs and later the Europeans. The country reached the height of its greatness during the reign of Tenkamanen, one of its greatest kings, who came to power in 1062 AD. The king lived in a palace of stone and wood, which was built to be defended in time of war. The empire was well organized. The political progress and social well-being of its people could be favorably compared to the best kingdoms and empires that prevailed in Europe at this time. The country had a military force of 200,000 men. In one of a number of holy wars or jihads, Ghana was invaded by the Almoravids, under the leadership of Abu Bakr of the Soso Empire in 1076 AD. This conquest brought an end to Ghana's age of prosperity and cultural development. The character of the country was slow to change. Nearly 100 years later, the Arab writer El Idrisi wrote of it as being the greatest kingdom of the blacks. In a later account, El Idrisi said, Ghana is the most commercial of the black countries. It is visited by rich merchants from all the surrounding countries and from the extremities of the West. In 1087, the country regained its independence without regaining its old strength, state organization, and grandeur. The ruins of the Empire of Ghana became the kingdoms of Diarra and Soso. The provinces of Ghana became a part of the Mali Empire and were later absorbed into the Songhai Empire. The great drama of state building, trade and commerce and power brokerage unfolded at Timbuktu, Queen City of the Western Sudan. 200 miles down the Niger from Timbuktu, the competing city of Gao stood. It was founded about the 7th century and was the capital of the large black empire of Songhai. The famous emperor of Mali, Mansa Musa, stopped at Timbuktu on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. He went in regal splendor with an entourage of 60,000 persons, including 12,000 servants, 500 bondsmen, each of whom carried a staff of pure gold, marched in front of the emperor. 280 camels bore 2,400 pounds of gold, which this African monarch distributed as alms and gifts. Musa returned from Mecca with an architect who designed imposing buildings in Timbuktu and other parts of his realm. To the outside world of the late medieval period, the Emperor Mansa Musa was more than an individual. He was Africa. He conquered the Songhai Empire and rebuilt the University of Sankore. He figured by name on every map. In his lifetime, he became in person the symbol of the mystery and of the fabulous wealth of the unknown African continent. He was the most colorful of the black kings of the 14th century. He still held his position nearly 2 centuries after his death. After the death of Mansa Musa, the Empire of Mali declined in importance. Its place was taken by Songhai, whose greatest king was Askia the Great, Mohammed Toure. Askia came to power in 1493, 1 year after Columbus discovered America. He consolidated the territory conquered by the previous ruler, Soni Ali, and built Songhai into the most powerful state in the Western Sudan. His realm, it is said, was larger than all Europe. The German writer Henry Barth, in his famous work Travels and Discoveries in North and Central Africa, calls Askia the Great one of the most brilliant and enlightened administrators of all times. He reorganized the army of Songhai, improved the system of banking and credit, and made the city-states of Gao, Walata, Timbuktu, and Jenne into intellectual centers. Timbuktu, during his reign, was a city of more than 100,000 people. People filled to the top, says a chronicler of that time, with gold and dazzling women. Askia encouraged scholarship and literature. Students from all over the Muslim world came to Timbuktu to study grammar, law, and surgery at the University of Sankore. Scholars came from North Africa and Europe to confer with learned historians and writers of this black empire. A Sudanese literature developed and many books were written. Leo Africanus, who wrote one of the best-known works on the Western Sudan, says, in Timbuktu, there are numerous judges, doctors, and clerics, all receiving good salaries from the king. He pays great respect to men of learning. There is a big demand for books and manuscript imported from Barbary, North Africa. More profit is made from the book trade than from any other line of business. Askia has been hailed as one of the wisest monarchs of the Middle Ages. Alexander Chamberlain, in his book, The Contribution of the Negro to Human Civilization, says of him, In personal character, in administrative ability, in devotion to the welfare of his subjects, in open-mindedness toward foreign influences, and in wisdom in the adoption of enlightened ideas and institutions from abroad, King Askia was certainly the equal of the average European monarch of the time and superior to many of them. After the death of Askia the Great in 1538, the Songhai Empire began to lose its strength and control over its vast territory. When the Songhai Empire collapsed after the capture of Timbuktu and Gao by the Moroccans in 1591, the whole of the Western Sudan was devastated by the invading troops. The Sultan of Morocco, El Mansour, had sent a large army with European firearms across the Sahara to attack the once powerful empire of Songhai. The prosperous city of Timbuktu was plundered by the army of freebooters. A state of anarchy prevailed. The University of Sankore, which had stood for over 500 years, was destroyed and the faculty exiled to Morocco. The greatest Sudanese scholar of that day, Ahmed Baba, was among those exiled. Baba was a scholar of great depth and inspiration. He was the author of more than 40 books on such diverse themes as theology, astronomy, ethnography, and biography. His rich library of 1,600 books was lost during his expatriation from Timbuktu. Timbuktu provides the most terrible example of the struggles of the West African states and towns as they strove to preserve what was once their golden age. The Arabs, Berbers, and Tuaregs from the north showed them no mercy. Timbuktu had previously been sacked by the Tuaregs as early as 1433, and they had occupied it for 30 years. Between 1591 and 1593, the Tuaregs had already taken advantage of the situation to plunder Timbuktu once more. Between 1723 and 1726, the Tuaregs once more occupied and looted Timbuktu. Thus, Timbuktu, once the queen city of the Western Sudan with more than 220,000 inhabitants and the center of a powerful state, degenerated into a shadow of its former stature. Now, West Africa entered a sad period of decline. During the Moorish occupation, wreck and ruin became the order of the day. When the Europeans arrived in this part of Africa and saw these conditions, they assumed that nothing of order and value had existed in these countries. This mistaken impression, too often repeated, has influenced the interpretation of African and Afro-American life in history for over 400 years. Africa's time of tragedy and decline started both in Europe and in Africa itself. For more than 1,000 years, Africans have been bringing into being empire after empire. The opening of Europe's era of exploration, Africa's own internal strife, and the slave trade turned what had been Africa's third golden age into a time of troubles. The independence explosion that started with Ghana in 1957 was a signal to the world that Africans were breaking away from the effects of slavery and colonialism and were determined to re-enter the mainstream of history. Author of this article, Dr. John Henrik Clarke is a distinguished scholar who has authored or edited a number of books, including The Lives of Great African Chiefs, William Styron's Nat Turner, 10 Black Writers Respond in Harlem, USA. He is professor of African World History at Hunter College, New York.